Hey guys, so this lesson is for Thursday. I hope that so far this has been going okay. We haven't had any issues. I hope that at this point, if you're at this video, you have had issues. You've already reached out to me so that we can correct those. But hopefully this is going okay and we're understanding everything and at least being able to see some of these things worked out rather than trying to learn them on your own. We're here today. We're going to be covering lesson 9.3. Okay, that'll be on page 315 of your book, lesson 9.3. But before we get into that, I'd like to go over what's going to be on our quiz. We're going to take this quiz tomorrow, Friday. And this will be quiz number 27. It's going to cover material from lesson 9.1 and 9.2. Okay, so I'd like to take just a couple minutes and go over what's going to be on there so that you can be prepared and ready for it for tomorrow. Okay, the first four questions of the quiz are going to basically just be writing the equations in standard form. Basically, we know that standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So you're basically going to be taking all of these equations and just rewriting them into that form. So move your terms around so they're in the proper place when we're doing these. Okay. The next four questions are going to be solving by factoring, solving quadratic equations by factoring. Hopefully we understand this okay. Some of these will be factored into perfect squares, which will make it real easy. And then some of these you'll have to factor into, do a little more factoring to find the two sets of parentheses. But we should understand at this point how we factor these equations. Remembering that we first have to put these equations in standard form before we can factor. Okay, so make sure that that's always your first step when you're dealing with these. But you'll have some that will factor into perfect squares, and then which will be real easy. You just solve for x, and then some you'll have to factor into two sets of parentheses and solve for both x's. So some you'll have two answers and some you'll have just one if it's a perfect square factor there. In other words, you have x plus a number squared. Okay, so it would look something like this. If I factor, let's say I've got x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, I'm going to factor this, and this would factor into x plus 1 squared. It's a perfect square. This times itself. Okay, and then I would just be basically this would be x plus 1 equals 0, and then x would equal 1. So this would be, or excuse me, negative 1, and this would be my answer. Okay, but in some cases I'll have two sets of parentheses. So instead of having two identical ones where I can just square, I'm going to have to find out what my two numbers of my third term are. The two factors of my third term in order to plug these in, and then I'll have two answers. Okay, so I'd be solving for both of these x's, and then my answers would be two answers. Okay, so you'll have a couple of those, and then you'll have a couple of the perfect ones where you can just solve for the 1x and be done. Okay, so review the factoring section, solving quadratic equations by factoring. Make sure that you understand that. They're not real difficult ones, but just make sure that you understand the process there for solving those. The last three are going to be solving by extracting the root. Okay, so this is our yesterday's lesson, I believe. But you have, you've got squares. When we have squares, we're going to square root things. Okay, in order to find what the root is. Okay, so in other words, if I have x squared equals 9. Okay, I'm going to square root my x squared, and then I'm going to square, what was that? And I'm even worse on this than I am the regular whiteboard, huh? I've got plus or minus the square root of 9. Remember this here, okay? If you don't put this in your answer, it's going to be wrong, okay? So just keep that in mind there, okay? So I have x equals plus or minus 3, okay? So that's extracting the root, and that is when we have just a single term for our square. Now, what happens when we have a binomial, okay? Remember, when we have a binomial, things work just a little differently. My computer's really giving me trouble today. Erase this and show you what I mean here. Catch up with me. Okay, so if I have something like x minus 2 squared equals 16, okay, I'm going to square root this whole binomial. Okay, and then I've got plus or minus the square root of 16, okay? And then we know that this squared, the square root of this would be x minus 2, okay, equals plus or minus 4, and then x would equal 2 plus or minus 4. Now, when I get an answer like this, I have to find what x is with 2 plus 4 and what x is with 2 minus 4, okay? So you'll have two different answers there. And these answers will not require you to put the plus or minus sign on your actual answer sheet, okay? So this would just be x equals 6, and then x equals a negative 2. Okay, so that would be your answers for those. So when we get something like a binomial that we're squaring, we have to solve for both the plus and the minus. So remember that as you're going through there. On that, let me just clear this here. Okay, so that will be your quiz, and we'll take that tomorrow. So make sure that you know how to do those two methods there, and we'll move forward from there. Okay, so today we're on lesson 9.3. Okay, we're going to deal with completing the square. Now, here's the thing. We were talking about extracting roots. Extracting the root is not always possible, okay? There are some quadratic situations where extracting the root is not going to work, okay? Look at the top of 9.3 on page 315, and I hope you've already titled your notes, Lesson 9.3, Completing the Square. We should be past all that, but make sure you title your notes properly. So at the top here, we have this equation x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 5, okay? So here we can use extracting the roots because we have a perfect square there, or excuse me, a pure quadratic is what they call it. And so you're able just to square root it and solve for x, okay? However, if we look down here and we get x squared plus 8 equals 4, it's not a pure quadratic, and you cannot solve that one by extracting the root, okay? So in which case, we would do completing the square, which is what we're going to cover today, okay? So now with completing the square, you can use this method with any of these quadratic equations here. And basically what we're doing is we're finding our third term and then factoring that quadratic equation, okay? So that's pretty much the complexity of this particular lesson. So write down what your definition for completing the square is, okay? This is the method of solution takes the given part of a perfect square and completes it. That's basically completing the square. Okay, so let's jump right into our steps, okay, for what we do to complete the square. Okay, so we're talking about, let me get my pen here. Completing the square. I'm sorry, my computer is dragging. Hope this doesn't affect my video here. But number one, what we're going to do is we're going to find half of the linear term. Now, hopefully you guys remember what the linear term is. Coefficient. Okay, so remember that our linear term is our x term. Okay. So it's the term that has just x with it, okay? So we're going to take whatever that numerical coefficient is, and we're going to multiply it by 1/2, okay? So that's our first step. And then in step number 2, what we're going to do is we are going to square UARE, square the results of step 1. Okay, so we take this term, we multiply it by 1/2, and we get an answer. Okay, we're going to take that answer, and then we're going to square that answer for step number 2. And then in step number 3, we're just going to add that term, add that square into the quadratic or the original quadratic equation. Okay, so we find half of the linear coefficient, that's our x term. We find that by multiplying 1/2 times whatever this number is. Then we take that answer and we square it. And once we've squared it, we're just going to add it back into our quadratic. Okay, it's technically not an equation because it's not really equaling anything, but you know what I mean. So we add that back into the quadratic. So let me show you what I mean by this. Okay, let's clear this out here. Hopefully you got those all written down. So we've got, what we're doing is we're completing and factoring the square. So there's technically 2 things that we're doing here, okay? Which means that your answer is going to need to include both completing, I just found how to smallen my thing there, cool. Both completing and the factor, okay? So you'll have 2 answers to this. So I've got x squared plus 10x, okay? So I have this quadratic here, okay? However, I need to find what my third term is. So in order to do that, okay, I'm going to complete the square. And what that means is I'm going to take this 10 and I'm going to multiply it by 1/2 to get my answer of 5, okay? Now, my second step before I can add it back in is to square this, okay? So 5 squared equals 25. So this is the number that's going to complete my square. So I'm going to add this back into my equation, plus 25. Okay, now I've completed the square. Now I factor. Okay, so I take this quadratic and I factor it. Okay, now I know that this term is 5 because this breaks down into perfect 5s here. 5 times 5 equals 25, so I can simply square it. So that's where I get this 5 from. It's whatever this step is, okay? In it, before I've squared it, this is going to be my number that's going to go here, okay? So keep that in mind. And then you're squaring this whole thing. So I can check this by taking x plus 5 times x plus 5 to make sure that it equals this, okay? But my answer is going to be this, and then also the number that I'm squaring, which is this or this, depending on how I put it in here. But your answer needs to include 2 parts, the completion of the square and the factoring, okay? So keep that in mind. Let's run through another one so you understand completely what I'm talking about. I got x squared plus 5x, okay? So the first thing is I take this 5 and I multiply it by 1/2, okay? Which is going to give me, in this case, 5 over 2, okay? And then I take this 5 over 2 and I square it, okay? Now here's the thing, to make this easier, I'm just going to leave this in the square form. I'm not actually going to square both of these numbers. I could, but then I just have to reverse and go back to this right here. So instead of actually going out and saying, okay, this is 25 over 4. I'm just going to leave it here, okay? So I'm going to add this into my equation. So I've got x squared plus 5x plus 5 over 2 squared. Okay, so 5 over 2 squared now is the completing the square part, and now I have to factor. Okay, so I take this and I factor this into x squared plus 5 over 2 squared, and this is my answer. Okay, so my answer includes 5 over 2 squared, that's completing the square, and then x squared plus 5 over 2 squared, and that's the factoring. Okay, so 2 parts to your answer. You've got the completing the square and also the factoring. Okay, so my answer would look like this: 5 over 2 squared, and also x squared plus 5 over 2 squared, because that's my factoring. So completing the square and the factoring part. All right, let's try another one. Okay, so let's say I've got x squared minus 1/2 x. Okay, so first of all, I take this and I multiply it by 1/2. So 1/2 times a negative 1/2 is going to give me a negative 1/4. Okay, then I take that negative 1/4 and I square it. Now I could square this, but I'm just going to leave it right here because I'm going to have to go back to this. So I stick this in. I've got x squared minus 1/2 x, let's see, plus a negative 1/4 squared. Okay, so here's my third term. Now I can factor. Okay, so I factor this then into x minus 1/4 squared. Okay, now, why do I have a minus here and not a plus? Well, I can put the plus here, plus, and then put this in parentheses and square that. But the truth is it's going to come out to this. Okay, so if I have a negative with my third term, this sign is what's going to be right here. Okay, that's where we get this negative from. Okay, so we factor. So my answer then would be negative 1/4 squared and x minus 1/4 squared. Okay, so this would be my answer. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough for you. It's a very, very easy method here that we're talking about. And I'm not going to give you a lot of homework today, but look at your practice problems here. We're going to do numbers 1, 5, 7, 13, and 19. Okay, that's 1, 5, 7, 13, and 19. That's going to be your homework for today. Okay, so make sure that you include both the number for completing the square as well as the factor at the end. Now, you can check this by going back and factoring your x plus or minus your number squared, whatever that your answer is. You can FOIL that to make sure that you have that correctly, but it's kind of hard to mess that up. So make sure that you include both of your answers in for that and the fact. So completing the square and the factoring part. Okay, so your homework for tonight is 1, 5, 7, 13, and 19. Okay, all just basic problems. They're nothing real crazy. I don't think I need to go over more. Let me just do one more just to make sure we have this down here. I'll pick the hard one. Let's say I've got 2x minus 2byx. Okay, so this is the term that I'm taking and finding what half of that is. So I have 1/2 times negative 2by. Okay, my 2's cancel out, leaving me with negative b over y. Okay, then I square this. Okay, this is the term that goes back into my quadratic. So I have x squared minus 2byx minus or plus a negative b over y squared. okay? So I stick that in as my third term, and then I factor. So I've got x minus b over y squared. So my answers would be negative b over y squared, and then also x minus b over y squared. So this is what my answer would look like. Okay, so that's how we do that. Hopefully we understand that correctly. If you have any questions, please give me a call or contact me and let me know. And then take some time tonight, including with that homework, to review your factoring method and your extracting the root so that we can take that quiz tomorrow. So this is how this is going to work. I'm going to create a video for tomorrow, and on that video for tomorrow, I'm going to take you through each question on the quiz. Okay, I'll give you each question, and then you'll need to take a separate sheet of paper and make sure that you include all of your work with your quiz. Each question on the quiz, make sure you include all of your work, and then we'll submit that just like we submit our homework. You'll take a picture of it and hand it in. Now, as you know, quizzes are not open book unless stated. So I am doing this on, I can't tell whether or not you used your book or not. So this is kind of the honor system here. But please, when you're ready to take the quiz, close up all of your books, close up all your notes, just have your sheet of paper to do your work on and your answer sheet. And do it that way. That's how these are to be completed. So you'll submit that by the end of the day. Now, the end of today, numbers 1, 5, 7, 13, and 19 are due. So make sure that by the end of Thursday, okay, you submit those homework questions to receive your homework grade. Okay, so that's due today. That's practice problems 9.3, numbers 1, 5, 7, 13, and 19. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully that was clear enough. And if you have any questions, let me know. All right, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Let me switch this over and then bye-bye. All right.